Right, and toward the end, I mean, David Gilmour said that at certain sessions and recording moments, he felt almost there wasn't any point turning up because you were so controlling.
You are such a stirrer. I'm not going there. That's it. I'm not going any further.
It's over. Just that simple. When Roger Waters said those words, it sounded final, clean, controlled, almost calm. But Pink Floyd didn't really end that day. It didn't end on a stage. It didn't end in a courtroom. And it didn't even end when Roger walked away. The real ending happened earlier in a studio during a song the entire world would fall in love with. A moment when Roger Waters realized something terrifying. For the first time, he wasn't in control anymore. And standing across from him wasn't an enemy, but a bandmate whose music spoke louder than authority ever could. David Gilmour never forgave what came next. Not because of a fight, not because of a lawsuit, but because of what Roger tried to erase. And this is the moment Pink Floyd truly broke. Before we continue, if you love Pink Floyd stories and want to help keep their legacy alive, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it. In the beginning, Roger Waters' control didn't feel like a problem. It felt like direction. Pink Floyd wasn't just a band, it was an idea searching for a voice. And Roger became that voice. He wasn't the flashiest musician. He wasn't the most technically gifted player. But he had something the others didn't. A vision that kept expanding. Concepts, themes, stories. Albums that weren't just collections of songs, but statements. That control gave Pink Floyd identity. It turned abstract sounds into emotional journeys. And for a while, everyone benefited. David Gilmour brought elegance and feeling. Nick Mason held the pulse steady. Richard Wright colored everything with atmosphere. Roger connected it all. Even he would later admit it. He knew he could be overwhelming. Ideas poured out of him faster than anyone else could keep up. But early on, that imbalance worked. Because everyone wanted the same thing. To matter. To break through. To create something timeless. As long as Pink Floyd was climbing, control felt necessary. Even comforting. But once the summit was reached, everything changed. And the thing that once held the band together slowly became the force pulling it apart. Success didn't bring peace to Pink Floyd. It brought exposure. After The Dark Side of the Moon, the band achieved something few artists ever do. Global recognition, cultural permanence, creative validation on a massive scale. And that's when the tension truly began. The shared ambition was gone. There was nothing left to prove. What replaced it was fear. Fear of slipping. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of being exposed creatively. Roger would later say they stayed together not out of hope, but out of fear. And that says everything. They weren't four friends chasing a dream anymore. They were four individuals protecting different versions of success. They didn't spend time together outside the studio. They didn't share lives. They shared obligations. Music stopped being discovery. It became territory. Who writes this? Who decides that? Whose idea survives the room? The friction wasn't explosive yet, but it was constant, subtle, grinding. And in that environment, one song would quietly redraw the balance of power inside Pink Floyd, not through confrontation, but through emotion. Comfortably Numb didn't sound like a rebellion. That was the problem. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't demand attention. It simply connected. David Gilmour's guitar spoke in a language Roger couldn't dominate. It wasn't conceptual. It wasn't intellectual. It was emotional, immediate, universal. And that terrified Roger, because the audience didn't need explanation. They didn't need context. They just felt it. Suddenly, the most powerful moment in the room wasn't coming from direction. It was coming from instinct. There were arguments. Disagreements over structure, tone, and intent. And later, stories began circulating. Myths. Legends. The famous one-take narrative. The idea that the moment was effortless and pure. Roger would later attack that story, calling it exaggerated, even false. Insisting the truth had been edited, assembled, controlled. But that reaction revealed something deeper. It wasn't about how the solo was recorded. It was about what it represented. For the first time, Roger Waters didn't own the emotional center of Pink Floyd, and he never forgot that. As the years passed, the arguments inside Pink Floyd stopped being about music. They became arguments about memory. Roger Waters began questioning not just decisions, but recollections themselves. Who remembered what correctly? Who actually contributed? Who was rewriting history to protect their own image? He openly said that human memory is unreliable, that the brain invents versions of the past that serve the ego of the person remembering it. And maybe that was true. But that belief quietly turned memory into a weapon. Because once you challenge someone's memory, you challenge their identity. You're no longer debating notes or lyrics, you're disputing reality. Roger remembered carrying the band creatively. Others remembered a collaboration that slowly became unbalanced. David Gilmour remembered moments where he felt there was no point even showing up to sessions anymore. These weren't small disagreements. They were incompatible versions of the same life. And the more Roger insisted that his memory reflected the truth, the more the others felt erased. Pink Floyd wasn't fighting over the past. They were fighting over who would be believed in the future. And once that happens, there's no creative solution left. Because you're no longer protecting music. You're protecting legacy. And that's when everything became personal. But Roger was about to make it permanent. When Roger Waters called Pink Floyd a spent force creatively in 1985, it didn't sound emotional. That was the problem. It sounded cold, calculated, final. To Roger, the logic was simple. If the creative vision was gone, the band should end with dignity. Anything else felt dishonest. But to David Gilmour, that sentence wasn't an opinion. It was an execution. Roger wasn't just leaving. He was declaring that nothing meaningful could exist without him. And that crossed a line no apology could erase. Bands survive members leaving all the time. What they don't survive is one member trying to decide the future for everyone else. That phrase wasn't about honesty. It was about control. Control over how the story would be told. Control over whether Pink Floyd was allowed to continue breathing. For Gilmour, this wasn't a creative disagreement anymore. It was a personal erasure. Roger didn't say, "I'm done." He said, "This should be done." And that difference mattered. From that moment on, trust didn't just crack. It collapsed. Because once you try to shut the door behind you and lock others out of their own past, there is no way back inside. And the conflict was only getting louder. After the words came the lawyers. And with them, a brutal realization. Pink Floyd was no longer just music. It was property. Roger believed the name belonged to a band that no longer existed. To him, continuing without its original identity felt morally wrong, almost like impersonation. But the law didn't care about philosophy. It cared about value, contracts, ownership, assets. The name Pink Floyd wasn't an idea you could retire out of principle. It was a commercially valuable entity that couldn't simply disappear because one person felt it should. Even Roger would later admit he misunderstood that reality. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Because from David Gilmour's perspective, this wasn't about money or branding. It was about survival. Roger wasn't just leaving the band. He was trying to end it. Trying to take something that still lived in music, in audiences, in meaning, and declare it dead. That attempt mattered more than any lawsuit outcome. Because once you try to destroy the foundation itself, forgiveness stops being an option. Pink Floyd didn't split in a courtroom. It split the moment music turned into ownership. And the silence that followed said everything. When Pink Floyd moved forward without Roger Waters, something happened that no one fully expected. The band survived. Not quietly. Not modestly. They filled stadiums. They sold millions. And the music reached people who didn't care about internal politics. For Roger, this was deeply unsettling, because his core belief had always been clear. Pink Floyd worked because of vision. And that vision, in his mind, came from him. The success of the band without his presence challenged that belief in the most painful way possible. This wasn't about royalties or headlines. It was about relevance. Pink Floyd continuing meant the story didn't end where Roger wanted it to end. It meant the audience didn't see the band as incomplete. It meant the music still spoke without his control guiding it. And that realization hardened everything. What could have softened into distance became resentment. What could have become respect became silence. Because how do you accept a future that contradicts your certainty? Roger never truly embraced that version of events. And David Gilmour never forgot the attempt to prevent it. From that point on, forgiveness wasn't delayed. It was abandoned. And yet, one final moment would briefly bring them back together. In 2005, the world witnessed something it never expected to see again. Pink Floyd stood on the same stage. For a brief moment, the years of conflict disappeared behind the music. The crowd believed in reconciliation. The media spoke of healing. But what happened at Live Aid wasn't a reunion of hearts. It was a reunion of memory. They didn't meet to rebuild. They met to close the circle. On stage, everything worked. Off stage, nothing changed. There were no plans. No discussions about the future. No sense of unfinished business. The performance wasn't a bridge forward. It was a full stop. For David Gilmour, Live Aid confirmed something quietly. They could still play together, but they could no longer belong to the same future. For Roger, it was a moment of pride mixed with distance. An acknowledgement of what once was, not what could be again. When they walked off that stage, the illusion ended. There was no argument, no dramatic fallout, just the understanding that whatever Pink Floyd had been, had finally said goodbye. And the silence that followed explained everything. David Gilmour never held a grudge over a song, not over a guitar solo, not over creative credit, not even over control in the studio. What he never forgave was intent. Roger Waters didn't just leave Pink Floyd. He tried to define its ending. He attempted to decide when the band stopped existing, who was allowed to continue, and whether the future could exist without his approval. That wasn't a creative disagreement. It was an attempt to erase, to rewrite the story in a way that left no room for anyone else. And once you cross that line, forgiveness loses meaning. Because forgiveness requires acknowledgement. And Roger never truly acknowledged that Pink Floyd could live beyond his control. David Gilmour understood something essential. Music survives because it belongs to people, not individuals. Once Roger tried to take that away, something broke permanently. Not loudly, not publicly, but internally. That's why there was no reconciliation tour, no second reunion, no final chapter written together. Because some fractures aren't about anger. They're about trust. And once trust is gone, silence becomes the only honest response. Pink Floyd didn't collapse in a scandal. It didn't end with a final concert or a dramatic goodbye. It broke quietly, in control rooms, in memories that no longer matched. In a moment when one man tried to decide where the story should stop, Roger Waters believed vision required authority. David Gilmour believed music required freedom. And somewhere between those two beliefs, something irreparable happened. Because bands don't truly die when people leave. They die when someone tries to erase what still lives. That's why the silence lasted. That's why forgiveness never came. And that's why Pink Floyd remains one of the greatest and most fractured stories in music history. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think control creates greatness? Or does freedom make it last? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this story made you see Pink Floyd differently, hit like. It helps more than you think. And if you want more deep, untold stories like this, subscribe and stay with us. Because some truths only surface after the music fades.